The last thing my husband said before tying me to a snow-covered pine was, "Look on the bright side, Claire. At least the funeral won't need ice." Then he smiled, climbed into the truck with his mother and drove away. For a few seconds I honestly thought the whole thing had to be a fever dream. The snow was coming down sideways through Pike National Forest, thick enough to erase the tire tracks almost as soon as the taillights disappeared. My wrists were tied behind the tree with orange utility rope. My left side burned every time I breathed. Ranger, my retired military working dog, stood pressed against my knee, whining low in his throat. 3 hours earlier, I had been lying in a private room at Evans Army Community Hospital outside Fort Carson. I was 46 years old, a sergeant first class, and stubborn enough to have survived 22 years in uniform. 2 weeks before that, during a training mission overseas, a blast had thrown me against a concrete wall. I came home with cracked ribs, internal bleeding, and a spleen the surgeons were trying hard not to remove. That Friday afternoon, Major Patel stood at the foot of my bed with his hands folded over a blue chart. "Claire," he said, "your body has been through a lot. I need to be honest. The next 48 hours are critical." My husband Mark sat beside me in his Carhartt jacket, rubbing his thumb across my knuckles. "Are you saying she might not make it through the weekend?" he asked. Major Patel paused before answering. "I'm saying we need to be prepared for that possibility." Mark lowered his head and started crying. At least I thought he was crying. His mother, Darlene, stood near the window with a paper cup of hospital coffee. She crossed herself, even though I had never once seen her attend church unless somebody was getting married or buried. Then Mark looked up and said, "Let me take her home." The doctor frowned. "She still needs monitoring." "She hates hospitals," Mark said. "You know how she is. If this is really the end, she should be in her own bed." I should have said no. That thought has visited me more times than I can count. But I was weak, tired, and scared. I wanted my kitchen, my old quilt, the sound of the furnace kicking on at 2 a.m. I wanted to believe the man I had shared 12 years with meant every word. By 5:30, a nurse had helped me into sweatpants and a Fort Carson hoodie. Mark signed the discharge papers. Darlene carried my medication bag. Ranger rode in the back of Mark's Ford F-250 because he refused to stay behind. At first, the route looked normal. We passed South Academy Boulevard, then a gas station with a flickering Conoco sign. But instead of turning toward our house in Fountain, Mark kept heading west. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Road's bad near home," he said. "I know another way." Darlene stared straight ahead. That was when Ranger began growling. Not loudly. Just enough to tell me he knew before I did. We were never going home. Mark drove another 20 minutes without saying a word. The heater hummed. The windshield wipers struggled against the heavy snow. Ranger had stopped growling, but he hadn't relaxed. He sat behind me with his nose pressed against my shoulder, watching Mark through the narrow gap between the seats. I knew that look. I'd seen it during training exercises years ago. Ranger only stared like that when he sensed danger. "Mark," I said quietly, "this doesn't feel like the way home." He kept both hands on the steering wheel. "I know a shortcut." "You've never taken this road." "It's fine." Darlene didn't even glance at me. She was scrolling through her phone like she was waiting for a doctor's appointment instead of riding with her dying daughter-in-law. The snow outside became thicker. The paved road disappeared beneath fresh powder, then turned into a narrow Forest Service road lined with towering pines. I recognized the area. During my years at Fort Carson, we'd occasionally conduct winter survival training nearby. There wasn't another house for miles. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Not because of the weather, because something finally clicked. If I died out here, no one would question it. The doctors already believed I might not survive. A woman with severe internal injuries dying during a snowstorm. It would sound tragic, not suspicious. Mark slowed the truck to a stop in a small clearing. The engine idled. Nobody moved. Finally, he unbuckled his seatbelt. "We're here." I frowned. "Where?" Instead of answering, he climbed out. Darlene followed. The passenger door opened and freezing air rushed inside. "Come on," Mark said. "I can't even stand." "I'll help." For a split second, I believed him. He wrapped one arm around my waist and carefully lifted me from the truck. The pain nearly made me black out. Every breath felt like broken glass sliding through my ribs. Ranger jumped down beside us, his ears flattened. His body became rigid. Then I noticed the orange utility rope lying in the bed of the truck. The same rope Mark kept for hauling lumber. "What are you doing?" I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, Darlene picked up the rope and handed it to him. The world suddenly became very quiet. Only the wind moved through the pine branches. Mark guided me toward a large snow-covered pine tree about 20 yards from the road. "I can't walk anymore," I gasped. "You don't have to." His voice had changed. It was flat, empty, almost bored. Then he shoved me backward. My shoulders slammed against the rough bark. The impact sent a sharp pain through my side. Before I could react, he grabbed my wrists. "What are you doing?" No answer. The rope circled the tree. Once, twice, 3 times. He pulled it tight. I struggled, but my body simply didn't have the strength. "Darlene." She looked at me with complete indifference. "I baked you birthday cakes," I said. "I took you to your appointments after your knee surgery." She shrugged. "You were useful then." Mark stepped back to admire his work. The snow had already begun collecting on my shoulders. Ranger barked once. A deep, sharp warning. Mark pointed at him. "Stay." The command meant nothing anymore. Ranger ignored him and moved closer until his body touched my leg. Mark laughed. "I guess he still thinks he can save you." I stared at the man I'd shared a home with for over a decade. "What did I ever do to you?" He smiled. Not angrily. Not nervously. Just calmly. "As much as I appreciate your pension," he said, "I've been ready to move on for years." He slipped his gloves back on and looked toward the truck. Then he turned to me one last time. "Look on the bright side," he said with a grin. "At least the funeral won't need ice." Darlene let out a dry little laugh. "She won't last the night." The two of them climbed back into the truck. The headlights swept across the trees. The tires spun for a moment before finding traction. Then they were gone. I listened until the sound of the engine disappeared into the storm. Silence settled over the mountain. My hands were numb. The temperature was dropping fast. I leaned my forehead against the tree and closed my eyes. A warm nose nudged my cheek. "Ranger." He wasn't whining anymore. He was studying the knots around my wrists. Then, without hesitation, he began biting the rope. The first thing Ranger did was bite the knot. Not the rope around the tree. The knot. That wasn't luck. It was training. Years earlier, an Army K-9 instructor at Fort Leonard Wood had told me something I'd never forgotten. "Most dogs pull," he'd said. "The good ones solve problems." Ranger had always been one of the good ones. His teeth worked carefully, tugging instead of yanking. Every few seconds he'd stop, tilt his head, and attack the knot from another angle. "Easy, boy," I whispered through chattering teeth. He looked at me for half a second, then went right back to work. Snow had already piled around my boots. My fingers were so numb I couldn't tell whether they were bleeding. Every breath sent a dull ache through my ribs, and my vision blurred every time the wind picked up. I knew enough about winter survival to understand exactly what was happening. Hypothermia doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it begins quietly. You stop shivering. You stop thinking clearly. Then if you're unlucky, you simply get tired. Dangerously tired. I forced myself to stay awake. "Talk," I muttered. That's what we'd taught younger soldiers during cold weather training. Keep talking. Keep thinking. Don't let your mind drift. "My name's Claire Morgan," I said out loud. The sound of my own voice startled me. "I'm 46 years old." Ranger kept chewing. "I was born in Pueblo." The words came slower now. "My dad worked for the railroad." The memories weren't random. I was grabbing onto them like handholds on a cliff. I remembered joining the Army at 24 after my divorce. People said I was too old to start over. Turns out they were wrong. I remembered meeting Ranger 8 years earlier at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, where military working dogs were paired with new handlers. The instructor had opened his kennel. Every dog barked. Every dog except one. A young German shepherd sat quietly in the back watching me. "That's Ranger," the instructor said. "What's wrong with him?" "Nothing." "He doesn't seem interested." The instructor smiled. "Oh, he's interested. He's studying you." He'd been studying me ever since. Another gust of wind slammed into us. Ranger growled softly as snow collected across my lap. Then he pressed his body against mine. His thick winter coat trapped what little warmth he could share. I leaned into him. "I knew you'd never quit." His ears twitched. The knot suddenly shifted. Not much. Just enough for me to feel the rope loosen around one wrist. Hope can be dangerous. It makes you rush. I forced myself to stay still while Ranger kept working. 5 more minutes. Maybe 10. Time had become meaningless, finally. The knot slipped. One loop fell away. I pulled with everything I had. Pain exploded through my shoulder. The rope tightened once before giving way completely. My arms dropped. I almost cried. Instead, I laughed. It sounded strange out there, like someone else's voice. "Good boy," I whispered. Ranger wagged his tail exactly twice. Not because he wanted praise, because he knew we weren't finished. I tried standing. My knees buckled immediately. The world tilted sideways and I collapsed into the snow. Ranger caught me before my face hit the ground. He barked once. Sharp. Urgent. Almost as if he were ordering me back up. "I know," I breathed. "I know." I managed to crawl a few feet before stopping. Every movement sent fresh pain through my abdomen. The hospital hadn't been wrong. I really might not survive the weekend. But not because of my injuries alone. The cold would finish what the explosion had started. Unless... I looked through the trees. The storm had eased just enough for me to recognize the ridgeline. Something stirred in the back of my memory. About 2 miles northwest, if I remembered correctly, there should have been an old U.S. Forest Service fire lookout cabin. It hadn't been staffed in years. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it was locked. Maybe I was remembering the wrong mountain entirely. It didn't matter. It was the only chance we had. I rested one hand on Ranger's neck. "Can you find it, partner?" He lifted his head, sniffed the icy wind. Then, without hesitation, he started walking. After a few steps, he stopped and looked back to make sure I was following. The first 100 yards felt like a mile. I couldn't stand for more than a few seconds before my legs gave out, so I crawled using my elbows and knees whenever the pain in my ribs allowed it. Ranger stayed close, never more than a step ahead. Every few feet, he'd stop, glance back, and wait. It reminded me of one of our old mountain exercises near Leadville. The instructor had smiled and said, "Never try to keep up with your dog. He'll adjust to you." Ranger was doing exactly that. The wind had settled some, but the temperature kept falling. Snow clung to my eyelashes, my sweatshirt was soaked through, and every time I paused, the cold settled deeper into my bones. After 15 minutes, or maybe 30, I honestly couldn't tell anymore, I collapsed beside a fallen log. "I can't," I whispered. Ranger came back immediately. He nudged my shoulder. I didn't move. He barked once. Still nothing. Then he grabbed the sleeve of my hoodie and gave it a firm tug. Despite everything, I almost laughed. "You always were bossy." His tail wagged once. I forced myself back onto my hands and knees. Another 20 yards. Then another. The mountain seemed determined to test every promise I'd ever made to myself. Don't quit. One more step. One more breath. One more minute. The snow muffled everything except my own breathing. Then Ranger suddenly froze. His ears shot forward. He sniffed the air. Instead of continuing uphill, he turned sharply to the right. "What is it?" He trotted ahead through a cluster of pines. When I finally reached the opening, I almost cried. Half buried beneath years of snow stood an old Forest Service fire lookout cabin. It wasn't much. Just a weathered wooden structure with faded green trim and boarded windows on one side. The porch sagged. The roof leaned slightly, but it was still standing. "Please," I whispered. "Please don't be locked." The front door resisted at first. I leaned against it with what little strength I had left. It creaked open. A rush of stale, dusty air drifted out. Inside the cabin looked exactly like something forgotten by time. A cast-iron stove sat in one corner. A folding cot leaned against the wall. Shelves held dusty cans of bean soup, peaches, and instant coffee. Someone had left blankets folded inside a plastic storage bin. There was even a propane heater with 2 spare tanks. I stared at the room in disbelief. "If this is heaven," I muttered, "they seriously need a cleaning crew." For the first time since Mark drove away, I smiled. Ranger walked the perimeter first. Old habit. He checked every room before settling beside the door. I locked it behind us, though I doubted anyone else was out in that storm. Getting the heater started took nearly 10 minutes because my fingers barely worked. When the small blue flame finally caught warm air, slowly filled the room. I wrapped myself in 2 wool blankets. The heat hurt. People don't always realize that warming up after severe cold can be painful. Pins and needles shot through my hands and feet. My ribs throbbed harder than before. I found a bottle of water in one of the cabinets and took tiny sips, remembering exactly what the combat medic had taught us. Slowly. Don't shock your body. Ranger curled up against my legs. His fur was still damp from the snow. I scratched behind his ears. "You saved my life." He sighed without opening his eyes. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin walls. Inside, I finally allowed myself to think about what had happened. Mark hadn't panicked. He hadn't made a terrible mistake. He'd looked me in the eyes and left me there to die. That realization hurt more than the explosion ever had. Sometime before dawn, I drifted into a shallow sleep. I woke to a distant mechanical sound. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Then Ranger lifted his head. His ears stood straight up. The engine grew louder. Not a truck. Not a car. A snowmobile. Ranger barked twice. Loud. Confident. Somewhere outside, a man's voice echoed through the trees. "Hello." He paused. Then shouted again. "Anybody in there?" I looked at Ranger. He looked back at me. For the first time all night, I believed we might actually make it home. The man outside wasn't a sheriff. He wasn't a soldier either. He was a volunteer with El Paso County Search and Rescue named Bill Sanders, a retired firefighter from Woodland Park. He'd been checking remote Forest Service roads after the snowstorm looking for stranded campers. Later, Bill told me Ranger was the one who found him. The moment Ranger heard the snowmobile, he bolted out the cabin door and disappeared into the trees. I thought he was leaving me, I admitted. Bill smiled. No, ma'am, he came looking for help. About 5 minutes later, Bill saw a German shepherd charging through the snow barking, stopping then running back the way he'd come. He practically ordered me to follow him, Bill said. That sounded exactly like Ranger. The ambulance reached us nearly an hour later because of the weather. The paramedics loaded me into the back, wrapped me in heated blankets, and started IV fluids before we even left the mountain. One of them looked at the bruises around my wrists. Who tied those knots? I stared at the ceiling. My husband. He froze. I'll let the deputies know. I spent the next 3 days in intensive care at the Denver VA Medical Center. Major Patel visited on Sunday morning. When he walked into my room, he stopped dead. I don't believe this. You don't sound happy to see me. He laughed, the first real laugh I'd heard in days. I've never been happier to be wrong. For the first time since the explosion, one of us smiled without pretending. Monday afternoon brought my first interview with Army CID Special Agent Rebecca Collins. She wasn't dramatic. No intimidating questions. No raised voice. She simply pulled up a chair beside my bed. Tell me everything. So I did. From the hospital, to the truck, to the pine tree, to Mark's joke about the funeral. She never interrupted. When I finished, she closed her notebook. Mrs. Morgan, I still use Sergeant First Class. A faint smile crossed her face. My mistake. Then her expression became serious again. I don't think this started on Friday. What do you mean? I think someone had been planning your death for a while. I frowned. What makes you say that? Before answering, she looked toward the hallway. Another man stepped inside. Gray suit, leather briefcase, late 50s. He introduced himself as Daniel Foster. He worked for Armed Forces Mutual Insurance. I know this is difficult, he said gently, but I need to ask you something. I nodded. Did your husband recently ask about your life insurance policy? I thought for a moment. About 2 months ago. What exactly did he ask? He wanted to know if my combat coverage had increased after my promotion. Daniel slowly opened his briefcase. I was afraid you'd say that. He slid several documents across my hospital tray. The first one was a request for information about my survivor benefits. The second was an estimate from a funeral home in Colorado Springs. The third made my stomach turn. It was a draft claim on my life insurance policy. Prepared, but never submitted, because I was still alive. Daniel looked uncomfortable. We believe your husband started gathering these documents before you left the hospital. I stared at the paperwork. He already knew what he planned to do. Rebecca nodded. We're not finished. She placed another photograph beside the insurance forms. It showed Mark loading furniture into his truck. The timestamp was Saturday afternoon, the day after he abandoned me. What's he doing? Rebecca folded her arms. According to your neighbors. And he told everyone you had died peacefully during the night. The room suddenly felt colder than the mountain ever had. He told them I was dead. She nodded once. And Claire? She slid one final photograph toward me. It showed a handwritten sign taped to our front door. Private family grieving. Please respect our privacy. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I looked up. So, I asked quietly, when do we arrest him? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she smiled. Not yet. Why not? Because people who think they've gotten away with murder usually make very expensive mistakes. I wanted Mark arrested that same afternoon. Every bone in my body ached. My wrists were wrapped in fresh bandages, my ribs were still taped, and every time I coughed it felt like someone drove a knife into my side. Waiting wasn't exactly my favorite idea. Rebecca pulled her chair closer. I understand how you feel. No, I said quietly, I don't think you do. She didn't argue. Instead, she let the silence sit between us for a few seconds. Then she said, if we arrest him today, he'll claim it was a terrible misunderstanding. I frowned. He tied me to a tree. And he'll say he panicked because he thought you were dying. His attorney will argue he wasn't thinking clearly. I hated that she was probably right. Rebecca leaned forward. But if we wait, he'll tell us exactly who he is. The Army officially listed me as being in critical condition. Not dead, not recovering. Simply critical. Very few people knew the truth. Major Patel, Rebecca, Bill Sanders, 2 detectives from the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, and the nurses on my floor. Everyone else, including Mark, believed I was unconscious and hanging on by a thread. Rebecca had another request. We'd like to keep it that way. So I'm supposed to disappear. For a little while, I stared out the hospital window toward the front range. Snow still covered the foothills. Somewhere beyond those mountains stood the pine tree where my husband had left me. I've spent 22 years wearing a uniform, I finally said. I can follow orders. 2 days later, Detective Ryan Morales showed me something that almost made me laugh. Mark had become the picture of the grieving husband. Facebook, church bulletins, neighborhood groups, everywhere. One photo showed him standing on our front porch with his head lowered. The caption read, "Please keep our family in your prayers. Claire is fighting for her life." Underneath were hundreds of comments. Praying, "We're here if you need anything." She was a hero. "God bless your family." I kept scrolling. A woman from our church had written, "Mark, you're so strong. Claire couldn't ask for a better husband." I stared at that sentence. Then I handed the tablet back. "I almost hope she never finds out." Ryan sighed. People believe what they see. Neighbors began dropping off casseroles, lasagna, chicken pot pie, homemade chili. One retired couple even shoveled Mark's driveway. Rebecca had quietly asked several of them to continue acting naturally. No one wanted to tip him off. The cruelest part was watching good people comfort a man who had tried to kill me. Then came Darlene. One of Rebecca's investigators attended Sunday service at her church. Darlene cried during the prayer requests. She hugged 3 different women. She said, "My poor Claire has suffered so much." Someone handed her a tissue. Another woman wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The investigator later told us, "If I hadn't known the truth, I would have cried too." I believed it. Darlene had always been good at performing. Ranger stayed with me at the VA under special permission from the hospital commander. Every morning he walked beside my wheelchair during physical therapy. Every afternoon he curled up next to my bed. One Thursday, Rebecca asked a simple question. "Would you mind if we tried something?" "What?" "Mark wants to visit." I looked at her. "He thinks I'm unconscious." She nodded. "He keeps asking." I understood immediately. "You want to see how Ranger reacts?" Mark arrived carrying grocery store flowers. Yellow daisies. My favorite had always been white lilies. He never remembered. He walked into the room wearing jeans and a Denver Broncos sweatshirt. His face looked tired. His eyes were red. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed every bit of it. He sat beside the bed, took my hand. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "You have to keep fighting." The words were perfect, practiced, almost beautiful, until Ranger stood. The low growl filled the room. Not loud, not aggressive, just deep enough that every hair on my arm stood up. Mark froze. Ranger took one slow step forward. Another. Then another. His eyes never left Mark's face. Mark instinctively backed away. Maybe I should go." Rebecca watched everything from behind the observation window. Later that afternoon she smiled. "Dogs don't testify in court." She closed her notebook. "But juries tend to trust them anyway." I smiled for the first time in days. Maybe waiting wasn't surrender. Maybe it was setting the trap. 3 weeks after I was admitted to the VA major, Patel finally cleared me to walk without a wheelchair. I wasn't exactly graceful. Every few steps, my left side reminded me that healing wasn't a straight line. "Don't get cocky," my physical therapist Karen said one morning as I finished another lap around the rehabilitation gym. I wasn't planning to. She grinned. "Good, because your ribs disagree." Pain had become part of my daily routine. It wasn't as sharp anymore, but it lingered. Pulling on a sweatshirt hurt, reaching for a coffee mug hurt. Even laughing, which I hadn't done much lately, came with a price. In a strange way, I welcomed it. The pain reminded me I was still alive. Rebecca visited almost every afternoon. By then, she'd stopped feeling like an investigator. She felt more like the kind of friend you make after surviving something terrible together. One Tuesday, she spread several folders across the small conference table in my hospital room. "We've got more than we expected." I looked down at the stack. "So do I finally get to hear everything?" "You've earned it." She opened the first folder. GPS. Mark's Ford had built-in navigation. He'd deleted the trip history. Unfortunately for him, modern vehicles keep more than one record. A forensic technician recovered everything. The route showed exactly what I'd already known. Evans Army Community Hospital, west on Highway 24, into Pike National Forest. Then back toward Colorado Springs. No stop at our house. No emergency room. Nothing. Just one long trip into the mountains. The second folder contained photographs from a gas station. Conoco. Friday evening, 5:57 p.m. The timestamp showed Mark filling the truck before leaving town. "He bought more than gasoline," Rebecca said. She slid another receipt across the table. Orange utility rope. Work gloves. Hand warmers. Energy drinks. I stared at the paper. "The rope." She nodded. "He bought it less than an hour before picking you up." That one receipt changed everything. It proved the rope hadn't been sitting in the truck by accident. He'd planned it. The third folder was even worse. Bank records. 3 weeks before my injury overseas, Mark had quietly opened a new checking account. Only his name appeared on it. After I was hospitalized, nearly $18,000 disappeared from our joint savings. What was he doing? I asked. Rebecca answered carefully. We think he was preparing for life after you. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they surprised me, because hearing them out loud made everything real. I still found myself remembering better days. That's what hurt the most, not the betrayal. The memories. Mark bringing me coffee before early morning Pacific time. Camping near 11 Mile Reservoir. Slow dancing in our kitchen while chili simmered on the stove. Had any of it been real? Or had I simply wanted it to be? One evening I asked Rebecca exactly that. Do people fake love for 12 years? She took a long time before answering. I don't think it's usually that simple. What do you mean? I think people change. She looked toward the window. Greed has a way of introducing itself slowly. I thought about that conversation for days. Maybe she was right. Maybe I hadn't married a monster. Maybe I'd watched an ordinary man become one without noticing. Meanwhile, Mark kept making television-worthy appearances around town. He attended church, accepted sympathy, thanked people for their prayers. He even organized a charity breakfast for wounded veterans. When Rebecca told me that, I actually laughed. A charity breakfast. She shook her head. I couldn't make this stuff up. Then she showed me another photograph. Mark standing outside my favorite diner in Colorado Springs. Across the table sat a blonde woman about 10 years younger than me. They were holding hands. I looked closer. I know her. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Her name's Melissa. She worked with Mark 2 years ago, according to surveillance photos. Their relationship hadn't started recently. It had started months before I deployed. I sat quietly for a long moment. Oddly enough, that discovery hurt less than I'd expected. By then, the marriage I thought I had was already gone. As Rebecca packed away the folders, she paused. We're close. How close? We have motive. She closed one folder. We have evidence. Another folder. And now, she smiled slightly. We're waiting for one mistake. I looked down at Ranger sleeping beside my chair. Somewhere out there, Mark still believed he'd won. He had no idea. His own greed was about to become our strongest witness. Rebecca called me just after 8 on a rainy Tuesday morning. I'd finally graduated from the hospital to a small rehabilitation apartment on the VA campus. Ranger was stretched out on the living room rug, snoring so loudly I almost didn't hear my phone vibrate. Her voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard before. Claire, what happened? I think he finally did it. I sat up straighter. Did what? He got greedy. An hour later I was sitting inside the CID office at Fort Carson with a mug of coffee I barely touched. Rebecca turned her laptop toward me. Take a look. It was an online marketplace listing. The seller was using a fake name, but the photographs, I recognized them immediately. My garage, my workbench, my storage shelves. He was selling my things. Army camping gear, snowshoes, fishing rods, power tools. Even the antique Winchester rifle my grandfather had left me. He can't legally sell those, I said. He doesn't seem worried. Rebecca clicked again. Another listing appeared. This time my stomach tightened. A wooden shadow box. Inside it sat Ranger's military service medals, his commendation ribbon, his retirement plaque, his Army K-9 badge. The same display had hung in my home office for years. I felt something inside me break. He sold Ranger's medals. Rebecca nodded. Or tried to. What Mark didn't know was that military working dog handlers tend to know one another. Not everyone, but enough, especially after retirement. The listing had been seen by retired Master Sergeant Tom Wheeler in Oklahoma. Tom had trained military working dogs for nearly 30 years. He recognized Ranger's name immediately. Instead of buying the medals, he called CID. Rebecca smiled. Sometimes the Army really is a small family. By that afternoon, investigators had obtained a search warrant. I wasn't allowed to join them. Honestly, part of me was relieved. I wasn't ready to walk back into that house. Rebecca recorded the search on her body camera. That evening she brought the footage to me. We watched together. The front door opened. Everything looked strangely normal. The same family photos. The same leather couch. The same quilt folded over the recliner. Only now, it felt like someone else's house. Detectives searched room by room. Kitchen, garage, bedroom, office. Nothing. Then one deputy called out, Rebecca, you need to see this. Behind a row of paint cans in the garage sat a gray plastic storage tote. Inside were dozens of folders, insurance paperwork, bank statements, copies of my military records, a notebook. Rebecca paused the video. You'll want to hear this. She opened the notebook carefully. Every page contained handwritten notes, dates, dollar amounts, phone numbers, appointments, almost like A checklist. One page read, life insurance. Check mark, verify beneficiary. Check mark, funeral estimate. Check sell truck. Check closed joint account. Another page simply said, hospital says weekend. Underneath, Mark had written, perfect timing. I closed my eyes. For a moment I couldn't speak. The detectives kept searching. Near the back of the closet in our bedroom they found a small metal lockbox. Inside sat my passport, birth certificate, social security card, and something else. A folded document from a law office. Rebecca handed it to me. It was a draft property transfer agreement, prepared 3 weeks before my deployment. Mark had already met with an attorney about transferring our home solely into his name. The agreement was never signed, because I was overseas, because I was supposed to come home alive. Or so I'd believed. Then came the final surprise. The forensic team recovered deleted files from Mark's laptop. Internet searches. Lots of them. How long before hypothermia becomes fatal? Does snow destroy fingerprints? Colorado inheritance laws. Military survivor benefits. Can GPS history be erased? Rebecca looked up from the report. I've investigated homicides for 14 years. She shook her head slowly. I've never seen someone keep such detailed notes. I gave a tired smile. He always did like making lists. For the first time in weeks? Rebecca laughed. So did we. She closed the last folder. Claire, it's over. I looked at her. No, I said quietly. Not yet. I wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted something else. I wanted everyone who had comforted my husband, who had believed his lies, who had mourned me while I was still breathing, to know the truth. And Rebecca already knew exactly how we were going to do it. The district attorney wanted to arrest Mark the moment the search warrant was complete. Rebecca had a different idea. So do I, she said during a meeting at the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. The conference room overlooked downtown Colorado Springs. Outside traffic moved along Nevada Avenue like any ordinary Thursday morning. Inside, half a dozen people studied the evidence spread across the table. GPS records, bank statements, insurance paperwork, photographs, the notebook, the internet searches. Assistant District Attorney Linda Chavez closed one folder. I've got enough for attempted murder. Rebecca nodded. I know. So what's the problem? Rebecca looked at me. Claire, everyone at the table turned. I took a slow breath. I don't want him arrested in the dark. Linda frowned. What do you mean? I want everyone he lied to see exactly who he is. The room became quiet. Finally, Linda leaned back. I suppose there's nothing illegal about that. Rebecca smiled. There isn't. The opportunity arrived sooner than anyone expected. One of Mark's neighbors called investigators. Apparently, Mark had invited family church friends and several co-workers to our house the following Saturday. Officially, it was a prayer gathering. Unofficially, Rebecca had another theory. He thinks it's a celebration. A celebration. He believes he's won. Meanwhile, I was learning how to trust my body again. Every morning began the same way. Physical therapy, stretching, walking, strength exercises. By Friday afternoon, I managed to climb a full flight of stairs without stopping. Karen, my therapist, folded her clipboard and smiled. I think you're ready. For what? She looked toward the hallway. To take your life back. The Army issued me a fresh dress uniform. My original one had been cut apart by trauma surgeons. When I put the new jacket on, I stared into the mirror for a long time. The ribbons, the rank, the U.S. Army name tape. For weeks I'd felt like a victim. Looking into that mirror, I remembered I was still a soldier. Karen stepped into the room. You clean up pretty well. I've looked better. You've looked alive. That made me smile. Saturday evening arrived cold and clear. The storm that had nearly killed me was gone. Rebecca parked an unmarked SUV 2 streets away from my house. Sheriff's deputies waited nearby. CID agents, insurance investigators. Even Tom Wheeler had flown in from Oklahoma after learning how much Ranger meant to the case. Nobody spoke much. We didn't need to. I reached into the back seat. Ranger climbed out slowly. His gray muzzle had a little more white than when we'd first met. He looked up at me. You ready? His tail thumped once. Good enough. Music drifted through the windows as we approached the front porch. People were laughing inside. Someone had lit the fireplace. Cars filled both sides of the street. Rebecca adjusted her radio. Everyone in position. A quiet chorus answered. Ready. She looked at me. This is your moment. I nodded. Then Ranger and I walked toward the front door. My heart pounded harder than it ever had during combat. Not because I was afraid. Because I didn't know how I would feel when I saw Mark again. Angry. Heartbroken. Empty. Maybe all three. I wrapped my hand around the doorknob. It wasn't locked. Of course it wasn't. Mark had never expected me to come home. I pushed the door open. Conversation stopped instantly. The room went silent. One woman dropped her paper plate. Someone near the fireplace whispered, "Oh, my God." Mark slowly turned around. He was holding a glass of iced tea. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then his eyes dropped. Not to me. To Ranger. The dog stood calmly beside my leg, watching him. Waiting. Mark's hand began to shake. The glass slipped from his fingers. It shattered across the hardwood floor. I looked around the room. At neighbors, friends, church members, people who had brought casseroles, people who had cried with him. Then I looked back at my husband. In a calm voice loud enough for everyone to hear, I said, "Surprised to see me?" No one moved. The only sound in the room came from the grandfather clock in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Mark stared at me as though he'd seen a ghost. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Darlene was the first to find her voice. She clutched the edge of the dining table and whispered, That's impossible." I looked at her. "No," I said calmly. "What's impossible is believing you two almost got away with it." The room remained silent. Several neighbors glanced back and forth between us, trying to understand what was happening. One of the women from church stepped toward Mark. "Mark, what is she talking about?" He finally managed to speak. I don't know." He pointed at me with a trembling finger. "Claire, she's confused. The medication." I couldn't help smiling. He was already lying. "Just like Rebecca predicted. You told everyone I was dying," I said. "I was. You told them you never left my side." "I didn't." "You told them you prayed for me every night." "I did." His voice cracked. "I love you." For just a second, I almost remembered the man I'd married. Then another memory replaced it. Orange rope. A snow-covered pine. His laughter. That moment was gone. Forever. "I have one question," I said quietly. "When exactly did you start planning my funeral?" The color disappeared from his face. "What?" "The estimate. The insurance paperwork. The notebook. The internet searches." Every word landed like another stone. Mark's breathing became shallow. Across the room, Darlene suddenly straightened. "What notebook?" He looked at her. She looked back. For the first time, they realized they weren't standing on the same side anymore. The front door opened again. Sheriff's deputies entered first. Behind them came CID Special Agent Rebecca Collins, Assistant District Attorney Linda Chavez, 2 detectives, and an insurance investigator carrying several evidence boxes. Rebecca spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Mark Evans," she held up a warrant. "You are under arrest for attempted first-degree murder conspiracy to commit murder insurance fraud theft and multiple related felony offenses." Gasps echoed through the room. Mark took one step backward. "This is ridiculous." Rebecca nodded toward one of the detectives. He opened the first evidence box. Out came the orange utility rope, still sealed inside an evidence bag. The second box held printed GPS records. The route from Evans Army Community Hospital to Pike National Forest. No detours, no wrong turns, no trip toward our home. The third contained copies of Mark's handwritten notebook. Linda held up one page. She read it aloud. "Hospital says weekend. Perfect timing." The room fell completely silent. One of Mark's co-workers covered his mouth. An elderly neighbor slowly sat down without saying a word. Then Rebecca placed the final item on the coffee table. Ranger's military medals, still inside the shadow box. Tom Wheeler stepped forward. "I trained military working dogs for 30 years. He looked directly at Mark. "You tried to sell those online." Mark swallowed hard. Tom shook his head. "You couldn't even leave the dog's medals alone." For the first time since I'd walked in, Mark completely lost control. He pointed at Darlene. This was her idea. Her head snapped toward him. "My idea?" "You said nobody would ever question it." She stared at him in disbelief. "You bought the rope." "You told me to leave her." "You wanted the insurance money." "No." "You did?" Within seconds they were shouting over each other. The lies unraveled faster than anyone in the room could follow. Neighbors stared in disbelief. Church friends quietly stepped away from them. One woman who had organized meal deliveries wiped tears from her eyes. "I brought you food," she whispered. "You let me comfort you." Mark looked around desperately. No one came to his defense. Not one person. A deputy stepped forward. "Hands behind your back." The handcuffs clicked shut. Another deputy arrested Darlene moments later. As they were escorted toward the front door, Mark turned around one last time. His eyes met mine. "I'm sorry." I believed he was. Not sorry for what he'd done. Sorry he'd failed. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Beside me, Ranger quietly sat at attention. just as he had done hundreds of times during ceremonies in the army. Rebecca walked over. "It's over." I looked around the room, at the broken glass, at the neighbors, at the frightened silence. Then I rested one hand on Ranger's head. "No," I said softly. "It's finally the truth." The trial began almost 8 months later at the El Paso County Courthouse. By then I was back on my feet. Not completely. Cold weather still made my ribs ache. Every now and then I'd catch myself rubbing the faint scars on my wrists without realizing it. Major Patel had warned me that some injuries heal long before they disappear. He was right. Some mornings I still woke up expecting to see snow outside my bedroom window. Other mornings I woke up grateful simply because I had another morning. Ranger had settled into retirement better than I had. He spent most of his days stretched across my living room floor, usually with his head resting on one of my boots. Every afternoon we walked through Memorial Park in Colorado Springs. Veterans often stopped to pet him. Some recognized the gray around his muzzle. Others recognized the medals hanging from his service vest. Almost everyone thanked him. I always smiled. "Thank him," I'd say. "He did all the hard work." The prosecution's case lasted 4 days. Mine took less than 2 hours. I didn't try to sound dramatic. I simply told the truth. How Mark had held my hand in the hospital. How he promised to take me home. How he tied me to that pine tree. And how Ranger refused to leave me. The defense tried to argue that Mark had panicked because he believed I was dying. Then Linda Chavez quietly placed his notebook on the evidence table. The jury read the page that said, "Hospital says weekend." Perfect timing. That argument ended right there. Darlene testified against her own son. Not because she'd suddenly grown a conscience. Because she wanted a lighter sentence. She blamed Mark. Mark blamed her. Neither convinced the jury. After less than 5 hours of deliberation, the 4-person stood. Guilty. Every count. Attempted first-degree murder. Conspiracy. Insurance fraud. Theft. The judge sentenced Mark to decades in prison. Darlene received a shorter sentence because of her age and her cooperation, but she would spend many years behind bars as well. I didn't feel happy. Relieved. Yes. Satisfied. Maybe. Happy. Number. There wasn't anything joyful about watching 2 lives destroyed by greed. There was only relief that they couldn't destroy anyone else. About a year later, I sold the house. There were too many memories inside those walls. Some good. Too many bad. With part of the insurance settlement and my military retirement, I started a small nonprofit called Ranger's Promise. Our mission was simple. Help retired military working dogs receive medical care, food, and loving homes after their service ended. The first donation came from Bill Sanders. The second came from Tom Wheeler. Within 6 months, dozens of veterans had volunteered. Turns out I wasn't the only one who believed those dogs deserved better. Every December, Ranger and I drive back into Pike National Forest. Not to relive what happened. Not to feed old anger. We park near the trailhead and walk until we reach the same snow-covered pine. I usually rest one hand against the rough bark for a minute. Then we turn around and head home. That tree no longer reminds me of betrayal. It reminds me that survival sometimes arrives on 4 paws. People often ask me whether I hate my ex-husband. The truth surprises them. Hate is exhausting. I'd rather spend my energy on people and dogs who choose loyalty over greed. Ranger is getting older now. His steps are slower. His muzzle is almost completely white. But every evening when I lock my front door, he still walks over, lies beside it, and quietly watches the room. Some habits never leave a soldier. Neither do the best partners. If my story stayed with you today, thank you for spending this time with me. I hope it reminds you that courage isn't always loud. And sometimes the greatest act of loyalty comes from the friend who never speaks a single word. Take good care of yourselves, and if you're lucky enough to have a faithful companion beside you, never take that gift for granted. The end.